asleep from weariness. Small wonder, said they, when the explanation stands close at the hand of a jug. Come give us a taste of your sleeping trout before we fall to. No need to wake the donkey yonder. He has had his share, by the looks of it. Then they drank once round and became mighty merry all of a sudden, but they did not quite lose their wits. Save us, Galleon, cried some. You began your feasting early and muddled your wits. You have stacked some full casks here instead of the empty ones, if there is anything in weight. Get on with the work, growled the butler. There is nothing in the feeling of weight in an idle tosspot's arms. These are the ones to go, and no others, do I say? Very well, they answered, rolling the barrels to the opening. Open your head to be in it, if the king's full butter bulbs, and his best wine is pushed into the river for the lake men to feast on for nothing. Roll, roll, roll. So they sang as first one barrel and then another rumbled to the dark opening and was pushed over into the cold water some feet below. Some were barrels really empty, some were tubs neatly packed with a dwarf each, but down they all went, one after another, with many a clash and a bump, thudding on top of ones below, smacking into the water, jostling against the walls of the tunnel, knocking into one another, and popping away down the current. It was just at the moment that Bilbo suddenly discovered the weak point in his plan. Most likely you saw it some time ago, and had been laughing at him, but I don't suppose you would have done it half as well. Of course, he was not in a barrel himself, nor was there anyone to pack him in. Even if there had been a chance, it looked as if he would certainly lose his friends this time. Nearly all of them have already disappeared through the dark trapdoor, and get utterly left behind and have to stay lurking at a permanent burglar in the elf caves forever. For even he could have escaped through the upper gates at once, he had precious small chance of ever finding the dwarves again. He did not know the way by the land to the place where the barrels were collected. He wondered what on earth would happen to them without him, for he had had no time to tell the dwarves all that he had learned, or what he had meant to do once they were out of the woods. While all these thoughts were passing through his mind, the elves began to sing a song round the river door. Some had already gone to haul on the ropes which pulled up the portcullis at the water gate, so as to let out the barrels as soon as they were all afloat below. Down the swift, dark stream you go, back to the lands you once did know. Leave the halls and caverns deep, leave the northern mountains steep, where the forest wide and dim stoops in shade gray and grim, float below the world of trees, out into the whispering breeze, past the rushes, past the reeds, past the marshes, waving weeds, through the mist that rushed white, up from the mere and pool at night. Follow stars that leap, up the heavens cold and steep, turn when down, comes over land, over rapid, over sand, south away and south away, seek the sunlight and the day, back to pasture, back to mead, where the kine and the oxen feed, back to the gardens on the hills, where the berry swells and the fills under sunlight under day. South away and south away, down the swift dark stream you go, back to the lands you once did know. Now the last barrel was being rolled into the doors. In despair, and not knowing what else to do, poor Bilbo caught hold of it, and was pushing over the edge with it. Down into the water he fell, splashed into the cold dark water with the barrel on top of him. He came up again, spluttering and clinging to the wood like a rat, but for all his efforts, he could not scramble on top. Every time he tried, the barrel rolled around and ducked him under again. It was really empty and floated light as a cork. Though his ears were full of water, he could hear the elves still singing in the cellar above. Then suddenly the trapdoors fell in two with a boom, and their voices fade away. He was in the dark tunnel, floating in icy water all alone, for you cannot count friends. They're all was no room to spare, not even for a hobbit, between its top and suddenly stooping roof where the gate was. Out they went under the overhanging branches of the trees on either bank. Bilbo wondered what the dwarves were feeling and whether a lot of water was getting into their tubs. Some of those that bobbed along by him in the gloom seemed pretty low in the water, and he guessed that he had dwarves inside. I do hope I put the lids on tight enough, he thought, but before long he was worrying too much about himself to remember the dwarves. He managed to keep his head above the water, but he was shivering with the cold, and he wondered if he would die of it before the luck turned, and how much longer he would be able to hang on, and whether he should risk the chance of letting go and trying to swim to the bank. The luck turned all right before the long. The eddying current carried several barrels close ashore at one point, and there for a while they stuck against some hidden root. Then Bilbo took the opportunity of scrambling up the side of this barrel while it was held steady against another. Up he crawled like a drowned rat and lay on top of the spread on to keep the balance as best as he could. The breeze was cold, but better than the water, and he hoped he would not suddenly roll off again when they started off once more. Before long, the barrels broke free again and turned and twisted off down the stream and out into the main current. Then he found it quite difficult to stick on, and he had feared, but he managed it somehow, though it was miserably uncomfortable. Luckily, he was very light, and the barrel was a good big one, and big, rather leaky, had now shipped small amounts of water. All the time, it was like trying to ride, without bribe or stirrups, a round-bellied pony that was always thinking of rolling on the grass. In this way, at last Mr. Baggins came to a place where the trees on either had grown through thinner. He could see the paler sky between them. The dark river opened suddenly wide, and there it was joined to the main water of the forest river, flowing down in haste from the king's great doors. There was a dim sheet of water no longer overshadowed, and on its slating surface there was dancing and broken reflections of clouds of stars. Then the hurrying of the water of the forest river swept clouds and of stars. Then the hurrying of the water swept if eaten out of a wide bay. This had a shingly shore under hanging banks, and was walled at the eastern end by the little jutting cape of hard rock. On the shallow shore most of the barrows ran aground, though a few went on to bump against the other, the stony pier. There were people on the lookout on the banks. They quickly pulled and pushed all the barrels together into the shadows, and when they had counted them, they roped them together and left them till the morning. Poor dwarves, Bilbo was not badly off now. He slipped from his barrel and waded ashore, and then sneaked along to see some huts he could see near the water's edge. He no longer thought twice about picking up a supper uninvited if he got the chance. He had been obliged to do so for long. He knew now too well when it was really, really hungry, not merely polite, interested in the dainties of well-filled larder. Also, he caught a glimpse of a fire through the trees, and that appalled to him with his dribbling and ragged clothes, clinging to him cold and clammy. There's no need to tell you how much of this adventure that night, for now we are drawing near the end of the eastward journey and coming to the last and greatest adventure, so we must hurry on. Of course, helped by his magic ring, he got on very well at first, but he was given away in the end by his wet footsteps and the tail of drippings, and he left whenever he went on sad, and also he began to snivel, and wherever he eyed, he was found out by the terrific explosions of his suppressed sneezes. Very soon, there was a fine commotion in the village by the riverside, but Bilbo escaped into the woods, carrying a loaf and a leather bottle of wine and a pie that did not belong to him. The rest of the night he had to pass wet, as he was far from a fire. But the bottle helped him to do that, and actually dozed a little on some dry leaves, even though the year was getting late and the air was chilly. He woke up again with a specifically loud sneeze. It was already a gray morning, and there was a merry racket down by the river. They were making up a raft of barrels, and the would soon be steering it off down the stream to Lake Town. Bilbo sneezed again. He was no longer dripping, but he felt cold all over. He scrambled down as fast and as stiff as his legs would carry him. Luckily, there was no sun at the time to cast an awkward shadow, and for a mercy he did not sneeze again for a good while. There was a mighty pushing of poles. The elves that were standing in the shallow water heaved and shoved. The barrels, now all lashed together, creaked and fretted. "This is a heavy load," some grumbled. "They float too deep. Some of these are never empty. If they come ashore in the daylight, we might have a look inside," they said. "No time now," cried the raftsmen. "Shove off." And after they went off, slowly at first until they passed the point of rock where other elves stood to fend them off with poles, and then quicker and quicker as they caught the main stream and went sailing away down towards the lake. They had escaped the dungeons of the king and were through the wood, but whether alive or dead still remains to be seen. Chapter 10. A warm welcome. The day grew lighter and warmer as they floated along. After a while the river rounded a steep shoulder of land that came down upon their left. Under its rocky feet, like an inland cliff, the deepest stream had flown, lapping and bubbling. Suddenly the cliff fell away, the shore sank, the trees ended. Then Bilbo saw a sight. The lands opened wide about him, filled with the waters of the river, which broke up and wandered in 100 winding courses, or halted in marshes, and pools dotted with isles on every side, but still a strong water flowed unsteadily through the midst, and far away, its dark head in a torn cloud, there loomed the mountain, its nearest neighbors to the northeast, and the tumbled land that joined to them could not be seen. All alone it rose and looked across the marshes to the forest, the lonely mountain. Bilbo had come far, and through many adventures to see it, and now he did not like the look of it in the least. As he listened to the talk of the raftsmen and pieced together the scraps of information that let fall, he soon realized that he was very fortunate ever have seen it all, even from a distance. Cheery has been in his imprisonment, and unpleasant as was his position, still he had been more nothing of the poor dwarfs underneath him. The talk was all of the trade that came and went on the waterways, and the growth of the traffic on the river, as the roads out of the east towards Mirkwood vanished or fell into the disuse, and for the bickerings of the lake men and the wood elves about the upkeep of the forest river and the care of the banks. Those lands had changed much since the days when dwarves dwelt in the mountain, days which most people now remembered only as a very shadowy tradition. They had changed even in recent years, and since the last news that Gandalf had had of them, great floods and rains had swollen the waters that flowed east, and there had been an earthquake or two. The marshes and bogs had spread wider and wider on either side. Paths had vanished, and many a rider and wanderer too, if they had tried to find the lost ways across. The elf road through the wood which the dwarfs had followed on the advice of Bjorn now came to a doubtful and little-used end in the eastern edge of the Mirkwood, in the north of the mountain-shadowed plains beyond, and the river was guarded by the wood elf king. So you see, Bilbo had come in the end by the only road that wasn't any good. It might have been some comfort to Mr. Baggins, shivering on the barrels, if he had known that news of this had reached Gandalf far away, and given him great anxiety that he was in fact finishing his other business, which does not come into this tale, and getting ready to come in search of Thorin's company, but Bilbo did not know it. All he knew was that the river seemed to go on and on and on forever. He was hungry, he had a nasty cold in the nose, and did not like the way the mountain seemed to frown at him and threaten him as it drew even nearer. After a while, however, the river took a more southern together into a deep and rapid flood, and they swept along a great speed. The sun had set when, turning with another sweep towards the east, and the forest river rushed into the long lakes. There it had a wide mouth with the stony, cliff-like glades at either side, of whose weight, piled together in shingles, the long lake. Bilbo had never imagined that any water shores looked small and far, but it was so long, and its northerly end from the map did Bilbo know that way up there, where the stars and the wane were already twinkling, the river coming down into the lake from Dale, and the forest river filled with deep waters, what must once have been a great deep rocky valley. At the southern end, the doubled waters poured out again over high waterfalls and ran away hurriedly to unknown lands. In the still evening air, the noise of the falls could be heard like a distant roar. Not far from the mountain of the forest river was the strange town he heard the elves speak of the king's cellars. It was not built on the shore. There were a few huts and buildings there, but right out on the surface of the lake, protected from the wind, the swirl of the entering river by a prominent heave of rock which formed a calm bay. A great bridge made of wood ran out where, on huge piles made of forest trees, was built a busy wooden town, not a town of elves, but men, who still dared to dwell here under the shadow of the distant Dragon Mountain. They still throve on the trade. They came up in the great river in the great days of cold, when Dale in the north was rich and prosperous. They had been wealthy and powerful, and there had been fleets of boats on waters. Some were filled with gold, some with warriors in armor, and there had been wars and deeds which were only a legend. The rotting piles of a greater town could see being along the shores when the waters sank in a drought. But men remembered little of that, though some still sang old songs of the dwarf kings of the mountain, Thror and Thrain of the race of Thorin, and the coming of the dragon, and the fall of the lords of Dale. Some sing too that Thror and Thrain would come back one day, and gold would flow in rivers through the mountain gates, and all the land would be filled with a new song and new laughter. But this pleasant legend did not much affect their daily business.